Sorry about that, friends. Good, excuse me. Good evening and shalom, and welcome to this episode of the Watchdog. I am your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are living in biblical times. And I want to appreciate every single one of you who is tuning in to this episode today, exclusively on the Synagogue News, where we encourage you to own the titles your enemies give you and think like a Neanderthal. I want to go ahead and briefly remind anybody who's here, please do like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to this channel. If you like the content and find us to be worth it, please hit that bell to get notified every time we go live. And if you are in the business of going ahead and following us, definitely consider following on all the different social media platforms which you frequent. Get this video shared out to those social media platforms. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? If you are going to different social media, different social media platforms, I would like to encourage you to please use alternative social media platforms. If you're a big fan of Facebook, there is MeWe and Telegram. If you're a big fan of Twitter, there is Gab, Parler, and Minds. If you really like YouTube, then BitChute and Rumble are for you. I encourage you guys to use these alternative social media websites because that is the best way for us to fight back against the big tech overlords and take back internet free speech, so that we can have free and honest conversations about whatever it is that we would like to talk about. But of course, what they tend to censor the most is things like politics, philosophy, the news, religion, things of that nature, right? So the interesting and edifying conversations. But of course, it does always apply to other things as well. So if you want to help fight back against that, don't rely on the big tech companies to listen to you. Don't rely on the government to bail you out. Rather, use the companies which have been provided to you by the capitalist system which exists. And by the way, if you consider yourself to be someone who's not politically right wing, maybe you're center right, maybe you're center, maybe you're left, that's perfectly fine. You being on the websites makes them less of an echo chamber, So definitely consider getting an account with any of those websites and follow your boy when you're there. Share this video onto the site. Also, in particular, I'd like to encourage you to get Rumble and BitChute accounts. We're uploading all of these videos, not live, but we are uploading these videos after the fact, same day, onto Rumble. I firmly believe, as I have very traditionalist and constitutionalist conservative views, that my time on YouTube will probably be limited. I have views that are very biblically grounded. I'm also quite openly a nationalist, and there's lots of other things that would make YouTube not too fond of what we do here. And even already, despite having only 50 subs, we have had videos removed and strikes coming out against us. So in particular, I would like to encourage you guys to get Rumble and BitChute accounts, specifically Rumble, and also to follow the Synagogue on any of those websites, but again, specifically Rumble. Reason being that if you like this content, it may be the case soon that those are the only websites where you can get the content. So definitely consider getting on Rumble, getting on BitChute, following the Synagogue there, and maybe even watch some of the videos there rather than on YouTube, just to kind of encourage people to go over to that website as well. So let's go ahead and jump into our pre-article discussion for today. And that is, I wanted to talk briefly about some of the court cases that have recently been in the news. Of course, the two really popular ones are Ahmed Armory and Kyle Rittenhouse. There is another really important one in Jelane Maxwell, but we're actually going to talk more in depth about that one. So I'm not going to comment on that here in the pre-article discussion. But here, for some of the cases that are finished already, right? We've had the Kyle Rittenhouse trial as well as the Ahmed Arbery trial. And then there was another trial where a man actually was found not guilty for shooting a police officer in his home. He claimed it was self-defense, right? And basically, the important part about it is that he was found not guilty. They'd had a no-knock raid at his house, and he was found not guilty on the basis that he did not know it was police. And so we're going to talk about these three cases here. And by the way, the gentleman who I'm talking about, his name is Andrew Coffey the Fourth. So we've had the Coffey case, which is much less popular, and then the two very popular Arbery and Rittenhouse cases. And so I'm going to briefly talk about each of those because I'll be honest, my faith in the American justice system was slightly restored over the last couple of weeks because of these three cases. One after another, I saw on my news feed that by the grace of God, our system does still work. Justice does still prevail. And though it may not always prevail, sometimes there is shady things that happen, such as in the Epstein case. Sometimes it seems like there's a patsy, and so while a guy who did deserve it goes down, there's so much left untouched, like the Weinstein case. And sometimes people do just outright get hammered by the law, like in the Chauvin case, when though there is a crime here, maybe they didn't actually do what they were found guilty of, right? And of course, there's even other things as well, like people will get out of it in some instances. Everybody has their flaws, and our system's no better. And recently, it has seemed that our system is getting worse and worse, that we'd have trial by media, trial by mob, trial by popular demand, if you will. Popular consensus is probably a better word, right? And these three cases really demonstrated that that's not the case, at least for now. And I really appreciated that. So I'm going to take them one by one. Firstly, we have the Kyle Rittenhouse case. So for those who don't know, which I highly doubt is anybody at this point, Kyle Rittenhouse was a young kid, 17 at the time, who August of last year found himself in Kenosha. He was there to protect a business of a local car dealership, as well as to provide medical assistance to protesters. And he was armed with an AR-15 while he was doing so. And there was an altercation between him and some of the rioters. He ended up retreating from the rioters, who then proceeded to pursue him. One with a chain, another with a skateboard, another with a pistol, and yet another who, despite not having a weapon, did attempt to drop kick him. He's been known now as Jump Kick Man. The crowd continued to pursue Rittenhouse until he eventually was cornered and killed one of them, namely a man named Joseph Rosenbaum, who was a convicted pedophile. The crowd then continued to pursue him. He continued to retreat until eventually he was knocked down. Andrew Huber attempted to swing a skateboard at his head, was killed in the process. A guy by the name of Gage Grosskreutz or something like that, I've never been able to pronounce his last name properly, went to pull a pistol on Kyle and then had his bicep, unfortunately for him, torn to shreds. And then there was a man who attempted to jump kick Kyle, and I believe jumped right over him, but he may have actually hit him. I'm not 100% sure. Regardless, there's video evidence if you guys would like to see it. I'm sure you've all seen the video by now. A lot of people were saying, specifically people in the liberal and progressive and establishment medias, were saying that Kyle Rittenhouse was somehow guilty of murder, even though he had tried to retreat, despite the fact that he does not have to do so, as there are stand your ground laws in Wisconsin. Despite the fact that he attempted to defuse the situation earlier, despite the fact that he was very clearly being attacked with multiple deadly weapons, like I said, chain, skateboard, and pistol. On top of the fact that just, somebody actually attacking you, even just with their hands. I mean, your hands are certainly deadly weapons. And not that that classifies legally as a deadly weapon, but if somebody is threatening you and all they have is their hands, I mean, they can do a lot of damage with their hands. You have every right to defend yourself, right? The video evidence clearly showed that Kyle Rittenhouse was innocent, and he ended up actually, despite the liberal media, the establishment media's protestations, he actually ended up being found not guilty on all charges and will walk away now a free man. He is now 18 years old. Life is obviously going to be incredibly hectic for him at this point. Arizona State University is already, which is the university that he is going to go to, or at least that he was going to go to. I guess I'm not sure anymore. Already has student body protests saying that they don't want him to attend. He has been called the face of white supremacy, even after the trial, by people like Biden and Kamala Harris, who actually also said that we needed to work on the justice system and that his case was an example of that. So there's certainly, a lot of things here that he's not out of the woodworks on. However, he was found not guilty on all charges. He will get to walk away a free man with no criminal charges whatsoever. And I think that's certainly a really good thing. And by the way, this also means that he is going to have quite a argument if he wants to go to court for, to bring these people to court, for defamation. People like President Biden, Vice President Harris, CNN, MSNBC, so on and so forth. He could totally pull a Nick Sandman at this point and become a multimillionaire, become set for life just on the back of these people and their stupid and fraudulent comments, right? And I certainly hope he does so. I hope he sues them for absolutely every penny that he can get. But nonetheless, the point there just being that the fact that he was found not guilty rather than something like a mistrial or of course, worst case scenario being found guilty means that he now has an open door to actually pursue those avenues of trying to sue these people and somewhat get compensation for the besmirching of his name. I know his name will always and forever be besmirched. So to a certain extent, it's almost null and void. But justice is justice, and I think justice should be served. Was very happy with that case because there were people actively threatening the jurors. There was a reporter from MSNBC who followed the jurors home, which, by the way, and I'm not kidding, that person, I think they obviously need a trial. But I think that person should be executed. Actually, under the law, I want to be clear, right? I don't think anybody should do any bodily harm to this person, but I do think the state, if you are going to threaten somebody's life in that way, I mean, I don't think that the death penalty is off the table at that point. If you are actively messing with the justice system, I mean, that is a very, very serious thing. It is a country corrupting kind of thing, and we should not take it lightly. Bare minimum, it should be on the table, even if the person is not actually charged and held to that kind of a standard. You might say that maybe I'm throwing out death penalty charges a little bit too leniently there, or liberally maybe is the word. But I am 100% serious. I think that level of jury tampering, if it can be proven in a court of law by a jury of peers, should absolutely warrant at least the possibility of the death penalty for the maintaining of our system. But nonetheless, the MSNBC reporter was chasing these, or not chasing, but stalking these jurors on the way home. Ended up having MSNBC completely and totally barred from the court as a result. There was protests outside that were very verbally threatening to the jurors and the judge. The judge was getting tons of calls talking about you're a white supremacist and a nationalist and all this other kind of stuff. And yet, despite all of that, the judge and the jury said, your threats be damned, and your nonsensical rioting be damned, and your stupid ideology be damned. We are going to pursue justice in this case, and they did. And as a result, Kyle Rittenhouse walks free today. Second case was the Ahmed Arbery case. Ahmed Arbery was a man who it's questionable what exactly he was doing. Some say that he was simply jogging. Others say that he was actively committing a small crime of perhaps vandalism at a construction site. Regardless, Ahmed Arbery was, and by the way, the second one of those seems to be very unsubstantiated. There doesn't seem to be any proof that Arbery was actively involved in a crime, but that is what some have suggested. Regardless, Arbery was pursued this has happened in Georgia. Arbery was pursued while he was running through a neighborhood, jogging through the neighborhood is what the video appears to show. And again, I think that all evidence suggests that that's all he was doing was jogging. But nonetheless, he was jogging through a neighborhood, and there were a group of people who, on the basis that there had been some crimes committed by a person who looked like Arbery, which I assume means more than just the fact that he was black in a white neighborhood, although obviously that meant that he stood out because he was black in a white neighborhood. Not to justify anything, of course, but I just want to be clear that I don't think it was strictly racially based, though it was certainly at least somewhat racially based. A little bit of nuance there. Regardless, a couple people, I can't remember their first names, but their last names are McMichaels, decided to pursue Arbery because they thought he was committing some kind of crime on the basis that somebody who looked like him was committing crimes in the area, and that somebody had seen somebody who looked like him who was actively committing a crime in the area. Now you can see how much hearsay is going around in this particular case, right? Obviously, this does not justify by any stretch of the imagination what comes next. But what did come next was these people in McMichaels, as well as a third individual who did not himself have a firearm, but did drive the pickup truck that is in the video you can watch, chased down Ahmed Arbery and cornered him, then proceeded to attack him, or at least approach him what appears to be aggressively. Arbery tries to defend himself by taking one of the McMichael's firearms. Obviously, if somebody's approaching you aggressively, then it's kind of a fight or flight thing there, and it sucks, right? Because on one end, you don't want anybody to die, and so you want to say, potentially that wasn't a wise move on Arbery's part, right? To go after somebody who has a gun, just simply not because he did anything wrong, but just simply to preserve his own life. At the same time, though, I mean, how do you know that this person isn't about to take your life, right? And that's the thing about aggressively approaching somebody with a firearm like that is Ahmed Arbery would have every reason to believe in this instance that firearm is going to be used against him in a violent fashion, in a potentially fatal fashion, right? And so while I hear people who have said, well, he shouldn't just in a pure wisdom sense, shouldn't have tried to take the firearm from one of the McMichaels here, you have to put yourself in his shoes. What would you do, right? You have no idea. You have no way of knowing that this person who just chased you down and cornered you with a firearm is not going to attempt to kill you, right? Regardless, it did not work, and the other McMichaels used his firearm to then kill Ahmed Arbery in what I believe to be cold blood. Well, they decided that they were going to say this was self-defense, and that was the defense that they were providing. And they decided that they were going to argue that on the basis of Georgia's citizens arrest law, which now no longer exists as a result of this case, they were operating within the confines of the law, which is not true, by the way. Within the confines of the law as it formerly stood, you had to have actively seen somebody commit the crime in order to citizens arrest them, number one. And number two, you have to actively have line of sight on them nonstop from the point they committed the crime to the point that you actually commit the citizen's arrest. Further still, if somebody feels threatened and wants to defend their own life, right, in a situation like this, you do not have a self-defense argument in that particular case unless it can be proven that the person did not actually fear for their life, right? And that you were not approaching in a way that causes it to be reasonable in the victim's mind to fear for their life, right? Kind of complicated to say that, but nonetheless, I hope you guys get what I was saying. The prosecutors in the county, for whatever reason, kind of kept the story under hush. And so once it was revealed, it kind of blew up, and everybody's talking about how, they're keeping this under hush. They're not actually going after the criminals in question, the murderers in question. And so it did explode, and a lot of people started to use it as a way to pull the race card. But lo and behold, it went to court, it went to trial, and once again, justice was served. All three individuals, the one who approached Arbery aggressively, whose gun he tried to take, the one who actually murdered him, and then the one who drove the truck, all three were found guilty on all charges, and they will serve prison time for murdering this man, as they very well should. And that is also a very important one, I think, because it obviously did not sit very well with the higher ups in that area. It could be for race reasons. It could be for other reasons. I'm not here to necessarily pinpoint any motives, but it is clear and obvious that the higher ups in this county did not want this case to go to trial, did not want this case to be known by the media, and did not want these three to be held accountable for their actions. Despite that, justice won out. The three are being held accountable for their actions. I personally, I think that they should serve probably life in prison. Even if we were talking about the death penalty earlier. I do agree with the death penalty for murder. Two of the individuals in question didn't actually pull a trigger, so I don't think that you could apply it legally to them, although they should certainly get very harsh penalties. And with respect to the one who did pull the trigger, I don't know. It's hard to say. because I don't think that this was an act of like malicious premeditated murder, right? I think that it was an act absolutely of malicious. It was a malicious attack, right? But I don't think this person intended to murder a person. I think that he ended up murdering a person because of his malicious and aggressive demeanor. And perhaps that's pulling hairs, but nonetheless, I do think the person should absolutely be, and I'm sorry that I don't have the exact names. I do think he should have as heavy a penalty as is possible. Obviously, we need to take these kinds of things seriously. You cannot pursue people and kill them just because you think that they may have potentially looked like someone who possibly committed crimes in your area. That's stupid and frankly disgusting, right? And so they should absolutely be hammered. Actually, you know what? I changed my mind. As far as the person who pulled the trigger, I do think death penalty should be on the table there. Should he actually get it? Again, I don't know. But I do think it is high past time that we take these crimes seriously, right? And when it comes to things like, and I'll go ahead and list them. When it comes to things like unprovoked premeditated murder, human trafficking, pedophilia, rape, and I would argue anything involving torture or tampering with the system of justice, right? I mean, I think it is absolutely reasonable to have a death penalty for those charges. Those are heinous crimes, in my opinion. I would argue, actually, you could even add a seventh there, which is treason against the United States. But that one's kind of iffy because we have a kind of a storied tradition of allowing political dissent, even very brutal political dissent in some instances. So I don't know if I necessarily agree with that in all instances. But I think it's high past the time when we start taking these kinds of crimes as seriously as they need to be taken. And absolutely, if you are going to pursue somebody, corner them, murder them, because you think they look like somebody who looked like somebody who was committing crimes a couple of nights ago. Okay. I mean, the death penalty should at least be on the table. It should at least be on the table, right? Again, if I'm a little bit too harsh in that, I apologize. Let me know your thoughts. I absolutely appreciate dissent, but that's my opinion. But nonetheless, 2 for 2, we saw justice done in the American courts. And then this situation that was not very well known, the situation with Mr. Andrew Coffey IV, who had his house attacked, which frankly is what a no-knock raid is. And I do personally believe that we should not have no-knock raids. They just cause problems, even in cases where the warrant is justified, which is most cases, to be fair. The no-knock raid just causes a bunch of problems. And just an immediate problem you can think of is if somebody breaks into my home and I shoot them, and I have no way of knowing that they're a cop because they just burst into the house, which is the whole point of a no-knock raid, right? How can I be held accountable for killing this police officer? At the same time, don't we want to have a situation where police officers aren't killed? So you can see just right off of the bat why like no-knock raids are just a stupid idea. Now, of course, they have their usages, which is, if you're gonna no-knock raid or if you're gonna, knock peacefully. The other thing, right? If you're going to knock peacefully and say, oh, this is the police at a trap house where there's a whole bunch of cartel people with guns and stuff like that, right? Obviously, that could be problematic. But historically, we have found ways to get around that, and I think that this is not the way that we should. Regardless, there was a no-knock raid at this man's house. And again, this is the Andrew Coffey case. He did not know that it was police who were actually at the house, right? Or at least that's what he said, and it does appear that that's now been proven in court. They did not properly identify themselves, or at the very least, he did not actually hear that communication, right? And in the what would you call that? I guess free fire of it all, right? He ended up shooting at the police. I don't know if he hit any of them at all, but they, in shooting back, did actually murder his girlfriend. She was killed in the crossfire there, unfortunately. Excuse me. Now, the prosecution in this case was saying two things. Number one, they were wanting to pin the murder of the girlfriend on him for starting the firefight. which of course is ridiculous. If somebody bursts into your home without identifying themselves and you shoot at them, that is by no means you starting the firefight. They absolutely started the fight, right, when they came into the home, even if they had a legitimate reason for wanting to arrest the person. And that's one of the things that I'll probably get some flack from my conservative brethren on, because conservatives tend to be very pro-cop. I'm not anti-cop, although I am certainly one who questions authority, and I'm much more the traditional conservative in that way. However, you have to understand that, again, if somebody breaks into your home, okay, bursts down your door without identifying themselves as a cop, right? You have no idea what's going on. They burst in the middle of the night. He was asleep, by the way, right? So in this confusion, it's like he has to just make a decision split second, right? In this confusion, he does what any man would do and defends his home from the invader, right? And they're gonna pin this on him, right? And say not only is he charged with attempted murder for trying to quote kill cops, right? But also, even though we're the ones who shot the girl, we're gonna pin that murder on him, right? No joke. This is what the prosecution was trying to do here, right? However, despite that, and there was very, very few people actually talking about this case. But despite that, on November the 19th, which was the exact same day that Kyle Rittenhouse was also found not guilty, Andrew Coffey IV was found not guilty on all charges. He does have another case because he unfortunately, he is a felon. And so having the firearm at all is unfortunately, not something he can do. And that just sucks in and of itself, because the fact of the matter is he is going to be found guilty for that. And, while it's a back and forth kind of thing with me, right? I don't want felons to have guns. At the same time, I feel like a man has a right to defend himself. So that's, the fact of the matter is, though, he will be found guilty for that. It's going to be a probation violation. Excuse me, I don't think it's a probation violation. It's a violation of his terms of being a felon, though, right? Parole, that's what it's called, parole violation. And that was stupid on his part. Certainly, that was stupid on his part. Again, it's hard to condemn a man for wanting to, utilize his Second Amendment rights. But in the case where, as far as the murder of his girlfriend is concerned, the cops will not be held accountable for it. And I think that's unfortunate. But he will not be charged with it. It's not on his hands. And if he does go to prison, or serves any sort of a penalty at all for this gun charge, it'll be significantly lower. We're talking like the difference between life in prison and a year in prison. You know what I mean? So justice absolutely served here. And, definitely my prayers go out both to Mr. Coffey and Mr. Rittenhouse, the surviving defendants in these cases, as well as the family of Mr. Aubrey. But, we can at least take solace in the fact that in less than a week, 3 consecutive cases that were relatively high profile came out with justice being served. We do not deserve it, but God is still looking fondly on our nation, at least somewhat. And I think this was evidence of that. So if you guys disagree with me on the cases, definitely let me know your thoughts. But that was my thoughts on the 3 cases. Let's go ahead and get into, because I just talked for 30 minutes. Wasted an hour, or 50% of my hour, excuse me. So let's go ahead and get right into the articles for today. And real quick, let me say a quick shalom to Richard Neal and Kevin Blah. I see you both in the live chat. Thank you very much for being here. And I completely agree, Kevin. I cannot imagine how absolutely awful that must feel. And of course, the really unfortunate thing about it, I think, is he is still going to serve some prison time, and even with that one, it is at least justifiable under the law. I don't know how much it's hard to condemn a man, like I said, for wanting to protect his own house and utilize his Second Amendment right. Under the law, though, he should not have possessed the firearm, and so it's not like justice will have not been served if and when he is found guilty there. But it is still unfortunate that in a case where you did everything right, and where you have even been acknowledged in a court of law to have done everything right, there's still something, and it's just because you just made a dumb choice. You know what I mean? And it's unfortunate there, but it's, justice at least here is served. Hopefully there is, the spirit of God with Andrew Coffey. None of us know, right? But nonetheless, I completely agree with you there. Let's get into these articles here today, friends. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. I'll try to get to everything that I wanted to today, but we'll see what happens. Just one moment. I see Kelby Quayo has also popped up in the live chat. Shalom, and thank you very much for being here. I'm going to go ahead and share my little bot thing here really quick. I call it a bot, but I'm the one who does it. But it's just something that I guess you could say, quote, spam over and over. But nonetheless, so first thing we're going to talk about today is actually not the headliner, but is the formal persecution of Christians in Finland beginning. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera on here. You heard that correctly. The formal persecution of Christians in Finland has now begun. What do I mean by that? I mean, the state has now officially and legally began pursuing Christians simply for being Christians. And of course, while they're not going to word it that way, they're going to say it is for hate speech in regards to the biblical teachings on marriage. Obviously, if you affirm the Bible, you cannot deny what the Bible says on marriage. And so it effectively is punishment for being Christian. Now, of course, let me go ahead and get up to the article here. Now, of course, this is something that has been happening for quite some time. There have been numerous politicians in numerous European countries like Denmark and Great Britain, for example, who have been punished or censored in some way, fined in some way for sharing their religious beliefs. We, of course, have seen here and in Canada, James Coates, Tony Spell, John MacArthur, Artur Pawlowski, persecuted by the state for having their churches open here in COVID. But all of these other cases, as bad as they weren't quite to this level, right? In the case of the censor of a politician, right, it just simply means that the politician himself or herself is going to have some sort of punishments within the confines of the government there. It's bad, right? It's persecution, certainly. But in the end, it doesn't impact the layperson, I guess is the point, right? Sorry, I got really itch here on my nose. My apologies. Anyways, in the case of arresting somebody like Tony Spell or James Coates, while that's absolutely persecuting pastors for being pastors, it's still only pastors, right? In other words, the rest of the body is not actually being arrested for that. I'm not saying that justifies anything. I'm just saying this is now a next step where individual Christians themselves are actually being legally charged with holding Christian beliefs, right? Which is a fundamental difference from everything else that's been happening. I'm not saying anything else about, those other cases, of course. Obviously, we are on the side of Tony Spell and believe him to be persecuted by the Louisiana state government. We are on the side of James Coates and believe him to be persecuted by the Canadian government, so on and so forth here, right? Artur Pawlowski, John MacArthur, we're on their side, right? But this is different. This is different. This is a Western first world country persecuting a Christian for actually holding to Christian beliefs. And if you don't believe me, let's go ahead and get into the article here. This is from the Federalists. The article here was written by a woman by the name of Joy Pullman. Actually, you can see she's got her picture right here if you're interested. And the article says, in case with global implications, Finland puts Christians on trial for their faith. So the Federalist agrees with my synopsis of this, which again is, in case with global implications, Finland puts Christians on trial for their faith. So let's get into it and see what the evidence for that kind of a bold claim actually is. Meet the man who appears to be the first in the post-Soviet Union West to be brought up on criminal charges for publishing long-held Christian beliefs. Juhana Poyola, I think is how you say that name, Poyola. I'm so sorry, I do not know even a lick of Finnish, but I know that their J's are supposed to be pronounced as a Y sound, but nonetheless, Johanna Poyola, wouldn't be cast to play his own part if Hollywood made a movie about a bishop put on trial for his faith. The Finnish pastor has inherited a place in the church of Martin Luther, but it appears none of Luther's pugnacity or vitriol. In person, Poyola, I'm going to get this right. Poyola, 49, is forthright but unassuming and gentle. By the way, that would be this person right here. Okay. Anyways, in person, Poyola, 49, is forthright but unassuming and gentle. Stereotypically, the Finn is thin and tall. He often pauses while speaking to carefully consider his next words. He listens attentively to others with far less impressive resumes. Of course, this is an opinion piece, so you are going to have to deal with this person, putting out her opinion. But that's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine. In more than 2 decades as a pastor, Poyola has ministered to congregations as small as 30. He has spent his life building a network of faithful churches across Finland, many of which started with a few people gathered for prayer, Bible study, hymn singing, and communion if they can get a pastor. In an in-person interview with the Federalist, Poyola urged fellow Christian leaders to be willing to seek out one lost sheep instead of crowds and acclaim. And of course, that is precisely that I can say as a Christian. I know not everybody who watches this particular program, since it's more news-oriented, is a Christian. But I can say as a Christian, that's exactly what I want in a pastor, right? Popularity be damned. Hitler had millions and Jesus Christ had 12. So, for the one lost sheep, we should do just about everything. And if that means the crowds of scoffers who aren't going to listen anyways stop listening, well, so be it. But regardless, this is the man who appears to be the first in the post-Soviet Union West to be brought up on criminal charges for preaching the Christian message as it has been established for thousands of years. Also charged in the case that goes to trial on January the 24th is Poyola's fellow Lutheran and a Finnish member of parliament, Paavi Räsänen, which we've actually reported on Paavi before, but this case now obviously has had even greater implications than when we initially reported. Räsänen's alleged crimes in a country that claims to guarantee freedom of speech and religion include tweeting a picture of a Bible verse. Potential penalties if they are convicted include fines and up to 2 years in prison. Just a second, I gotta get this itch here. My apologies. Super unflattering, I know. Anyways. Finnish authorities, the Bible is hate speech. Räsänen and Poyola are being charged with hate speech for respectively writing and publishing a 24-page 2004 booklet that explains basic Christian theology about sex and marriage, which reserves sex exclusively for within marriage, which can only consist of one man and one woman for life. Okay, couple things that need to be pointed out here right off the bat. Even if this was problematic, which of course it's not, but even if this was problematic, did you not read 2004 booklet? Ladies and gentlemen, these people are charged with publishing words 17 years ago. Let's ignore the fact for a second that they're charged with publishing words. Let's ignore the fact for a second, even still and even further, that the words in which they publish are basic Christian teaching, right? I was going to say theology, but that word would not be accurate. But on top of that, even if it was legitimate to prosecute them here, which it absolutely is not, these words were published 17 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, when the communists come and take control here in the United States, which they certainly seek to do, men like Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders and other such globalists aim to see that kind of thing occur, as does the Wicked Witch of the West herself, our vice president, right? Excuse me. Well, I guess Nancy Pelosi is also from California, so which one is the Wicked Witch of the West? I don't know. Feinstein's also from California, so, maybe there's a whole coven of Wicked Witches of the West. But I digress. These people absolutely aim to see this same kind of thing happen here in the United States. You mark my words. You mark my words. Sorry for the little bit of a broken voice there. Excuse me. Somewhat dry mouth, and also now I'm burping. I apologize. I'm just super flattering to you guys today. I hope you appreciate this show. But yeah, so if that actually ends up occurring, friends, if people like AOC, if people like Dianne Feinstein, if people like like the Wicked Witch that I was just talking about, and the semi-sapient bowl of pudding, which currently leads this country, right? If these people get their way, then this is going to be coming to the United States, which means that if you published a Bible verse, say in 2004, you could be charged with it. You could be charged with it. So even if you decide, hey, for the sake of my family, for the sake of my own self, and keeping myself free, I'm not going to, poke the bull anymore once they get power. Oh, no. They want to retroactively look at everything you've said and then throw you in jail for that, right? But let's continue. What are they actually being, oh my goodness, excuse me, jeez. What are they actually being arrested for? For teaching that sex is reserved for a man and woman within marriage that lasts for life. In other words, don't fornicate. Monogamy is the only way to go, and heterosexuality is the only way to go. On top of that, you cannot divorce according to the Bible. Okay, obviously there are some extenuating circumstances where somebody has to get a divorce. I get that. Okay, but the Bible says God hates divorce. Period. End of the conversation. You may not agree with that. Perfectly fine. Okay, you should at least agree with somebody's right to say that, and also that the Bible clearly says that, because it does. Okay, these are the things that this person is being prosecuted for, and he did this 17 years ago. I want to stress that again. See, because the totalitarians, the tyrants, the coronarchy here, right? They do not care how long ago you committed this so-called crime. They don't care. They aim to see you punished. The Finnish prosecutor claims centuries-old Christian teachings about sex incite hatred and violate legal preferences for government-privileged identity groups. Yes, government-privileged identity groups. And by the way, if that concept does not sicken you, the idea that a group, by virtue of their identity, could somehow be privileged by the government, could somehow get more rights by the government, could somehow have things you can't say about them because they're protected by the government. If that is not just absolutely revolting to your core, we do not share the same values, my friends. And I understand that, that's a rhetorical thing. Most of the people watching this program are obviously going to agree with me, but nonetheless, you guys get what I'm saying. Writer Rod Dreher pointed out the witch hunt nature of this prosecution. Quote, Rossinen wrote the pamphlet 7 years before LGBT was added to the national hate speech law as a protected class. In other words, even so, this should not be a crime at all, but this crime was committed before it was actually a crime. Imagine, if you will, if they decided to make alcohol illegal tomorrow, and then they found out that sometime in 2006, you had wine at a bar. And they said, you know what? We need to charge him for that. That's essentially what's going on here. And on top of that, they waited 10 years. They waited another 10 years after the law was passed to go back retroactively and charge the person with saying things 7 years before the law was passed, which ends up now being 17 years since the crime was committed. If you guys can't see, if you're only listening, I'm putting air quotes every time I say crime. Anyways, she was investigated once before for the pamphlet and cleared, but now she's going to undergo another interrogation, end quote. So much for an idea of double jeopardy, right? Thank the Lord for the Constitution. Rossinen and Poyola both have adamantly affirmed, quote, the divinely given dignity, value, and human rights of all, including all who identify with the LGBTQ community, end quote. And by the way, let me be clear, you can't only, if you guys disagree with this, that's fine. Throw something in the comment section and argue with me. But I would say you can only affirm divinely given dignity, value, and human rights of the LGBTQ, quote, community, right? If you're a Christian. Because no other ideology says that they actually have inherent value or dignity. None. Certainly not an atheist or secular ideology, right? That doesn't obviously mean that the act is biblical, right? But even somebody who is committing abiblical, abhorrent acts in the eyes of God is still considered to have inherent dignity and value in the Christian system. You can't say that for a secular system. You can't say that for a Buddhistic system or a Muslim system. You can't say it. But you can in the Christian system, right? You can in the Christian system. So ironically, the same thing that these people are being charged with believing, namely Christianity, right, is the very thing which allows them to affirm the dignity, value, and human rights of those, including the LGBTQ community, as they say. The alphabet soup people. Christian theology teaches all human beings are precious, as all are made in God's image and offered eternal life through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I do believe that, but of course, this is not my apologetics show, so we're going to move on. In advance of the trial, Rosanen and Poyola have been interrogated by police for hours about their theology. Yes, about their theology. No joke. They have been interrogated about what they believe the Bible teaches. Not kidding. Poyola told me in the interrogation police treated Christian beliefs as thought crimes. In a statement, Rosanen noted that the police publicly admitted their interpretation of Finland's law would make publishing the Bible a hate crime. Yes, police publicly admitted that their interpretation of Finland's law would make publishing the Bible a hate crime. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a link right here to the article in question. Let me go ahead and actually post that in the live chat for you. We'll get back to the article here in just a second, but I want to allow you guys to read into the police admitting themselves that under the current precedents they are setting, publishing the Bible is in and of itself a hate crime. Which, by the way, let me say plainly, hate crimes, they do not exist, in my opinion. Things are either crimes or they are not crimes, okay? If somebody murdered somebody because he's black, that is absolutely no different than somebody murdering somebody because he wants his shoes, okay? The fact of the matter is they're both murderers. It's not any different. And they both should have potentially the death penalty over their heads, as I said earlier. Quote, it is impossible for me to think that the classical Christian views and the doctrine of the majority of denominations would become illegal. I think this person needs to be perhaps understanding the signs of the times a little better, but I digress. It's always one of those things, right? It seems like it's obvious that it's going to happen until it happens in your backyard, right? So I guess I shouldn't be too harsh on this pastor here, but excuse me, not the pastor. This is Rosanen. Anyways, the question here is about the core of Christian faith, how a person gets saved into unity with God and into everlasting life through the redemptive sacrifice of Jesus. Therefore, it is crucial to talk also about the nature of sin, Rosanen told Dreyer. As we are living in a democratic country, allegedly, we must be able to disagree and express our disagreement. We have to be able to cope with speech that we feel insults our feelings. Many questions are so debatable, and contradictory that we have to have the possibility of discussing. Otherwise, the development is towards a totalitarian system with only one correct view, end quote. Of course, that's 100% true. Human rights lawyer, this is major international implications. Human rights lawyer Paul Coleman, who spoke to the Federalists from his Alliance Defending Freedom International office in Vienna, Austria, which Austria, of course, is having its own problems with other things, but we won't go there, says Poyola and Rosanen's cases are a, quote, canary in a coal mine, end quote, for freedom of speech across the West and freedom of religion across the West as well, I would like to add. ADF International, is providing legal support for Poyola and Rosanen's cases. Quote, although all European countries have these hate speech laws, and these hate speech laws are increasingly being used against citizens for things that they say, this is the first time we've really seen, Christians face criminal prosecution for explaining their biblical views, Coleman said. It is unprecedented. We've not seen attacks on free speech on this level in Europe, and that's why they are extremely important cases, not just for the people of Finland and Paavi Rosanen and the bishop themselves, but for all of Europe, and I would say the United States as well, because one thing you'll notice about Europe is whatever Europe does, the United States is going to do about a decade later, right? Sometimes it's a little bit longer than that. Sometimes it's a little bit less than that. But anything terrible and debaucherous that Europe does, just give it about a decade, it will be here in the United States. If you don't believe me, just look at the history of Marxism in the West, look at the history of anarchism in the West, atheism in the West, evolutionism in the West, fascism in the West, look at the Free the Nipple movement, look at feminism, look at, all these different kinds of things. They start in Europe, they get popular in Europe, and then they come to the United States about a decade later. Every time. right? We like to think that we set precedent, but we actually just take precedent that other people set and do it in a very extreme manner, which of course is not a laughing matter if one wants to talk about horrible ideologies like communism. But I digress. If this is upheld in one jurisdiction, we will no doubt see it in other jurisdictions as well. And obviously, I believe that's totally true. And really, I think that these hate speech laws should be done away with entirely. Hate speech is not a thing. Okay, you either have free speech or you don't. Controversial opinion, you should have the right to get up and say that the KKK is justified, or that the Nation of Islam is justified, or that Hitler was a perfectly swell guy. Now, I think if you say any of those three things, you're detestable. Okay, your views are absolutely, positively detestable. In fact, what many of you guys may not know is my original debate opponents before I started actually debating here on YouTube. The people I would debate the most were Black Hebrew Israelites and anti-Semites, basically. I'd just be general with it because there's a whole bunch of different ideologies those would come in, right? I find those views to be absolutely detestable, and they are the original things that I ever started actually going to, and I will actually get back into them here again. So I'm by no means defending any of these people and any of the disgusting views that they have, right? However, should they be able to have them? Should they be able to speak about them publicly and publish them? Absolutely. Of course. That's not even a question. That's not even a question. If you think it is a question, I would just highly advise you to re-examine what you actually think freedom of speech means, because it's not what the Constitution thinks freedom of speech means. It's not what the majority of people who just hear that phrase think freedom of speech means. And while I understand it's certainly awful to hear somebody say something terrible, like, for example, Muslims saying that jihad should be done against the United States, or neo-Nazis saying that Jews are less than people. I understand those things are absolutely disgusting and detestable. But it is just as disgusting and detestable to censor those things rather than to approach those things, to fight those things, to destroy those things by way of logic, argument, and of course, prayer to the Lord, because it is His Holy Spirit which intercedes and I think leads people away from such detestable beliefs. But nonetheless, that's obviously getting into the apologetics a little bit again. The point is that even if these things were hateful, hate speech should not be a thing. It's not a thing, right? Hate speech is simply speech that you don't like. One man's hate speech is another man's opinion. And pretty soon, what you believe will be labeled by somebody as hate speech. Doesn't matter what you believe. Some person somewhere will label it as hate speech. Rabbi Meir Kahane famously said, after his party was banned in 1988, because of its undemocratic nature, right, that if he ever were to found a new party, and take power in Israel and actually become the prime minister, have the majority party, have an established government, all that kind of stuff, using the same precedent that they had set, he could say, hey, you guys banned a certain political party from being able to run in these elections, which is undemocratic, and therefore your political party cannot run in these elections. What's the point? The point is, if you disagree with somebody or not, it doesn't matter. Freedom of speech needs to be preserved. Freedom of speech needs to be preserved. And of course, in this particular instance, we're seeing something that is by no means hateful. It is just simply the teaching of the Bible. The Bible says that homosexuality is sinful. The Bible says fornication, meaning sex outside of marriage, is sinful. The Bible says that polygamy, polyamory, adultery, things of that nature are sinful. Okay? If you disagree with that, that's fine. That's why I would defend freedom of speech, just so you can disagree with that. But I should be able to disagree with you right back, right? That is freedom. That is the way this country is supposed to work. But hate speech laws exist in every European country and Western countries such as Canada and Australia, and descended from Soviet influence. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I don't think the United States federally has any hate speech laws. And I think while there are a couple states that do, I think the overwhelming majority of states do not. But I could be wrong about that. But anyways, sorry. Coleman called them, quote, sleeper laws, which I totally agree with, end quote, saying that in other countries, quote, they could be used anytime, just like they are in Finland. People need to mobilize against these laws and overturn them. And again, 100% agree, hate speech laws should not exist. Legally privileging certain sexual behavior has thus broken Western countries' promises of equality before the law for all citizens, as well as enabling government discrimination against citizens who exercise their free speech and religious liberty, as in the Baronel Stutzman and Jack Phillips cases in the United States, which Jack Phillips, I don't know the other person, but Jack Phillips is the man who owned the cake shop and said that he did not want to actually bake a cake for the homosexual wedding, right? I'm sorry, friends. My nose is just itching tremendously and it will not stop. Anyways, and by the way, I'd like to point out, not only is it true that this creates a situation where we actually no longer have equality under the law, but it is also true, ladies and gentlemen, that we now have a situation where the government is actually going out of its way to endorse debauchery, okay? And believe me when I say, there will come a point in time where you will not be able to criticize people for being promiscuous. That's slut shaming. Where you will not be able to criticize divorce, because that's divorce shaming or something, single mom shaming, I don't know. You will not be able to criticize people being polyamorous. You will not be able to criticize people being polygamous, at least within certain parameters, because, of course, polygamy is only okay if certain people do it. And I think you guys probably know the implications that I'm giving off here. You are not going to be able to criticize people for walking outside dressed up like they're going to a Cardi B concert, right? Or for, quote, freeing the nipple, or for any other debased sexual thing. It'll even get to the point where you're not able to criticize people for dating 14, 13, 12-year-olds. You think I'm kidding? You think I'm kidding? Look at a recent California law that said it was actually totally okay for you to actually sleep with somebody who is 14 so long as you were within 10 years their range. That's 24, ladies and gentlemen. That means that I have a whole nother year that I can sleep with a 14-year-old in California. I hope that kind of creeps you out the way I worded it, because I did it on purpose. It's disgusting. That's absolutely disgusting, right? But that's legal in the state of California. Here's another fun fact for you: in the city of New York, excuse me, if you were to actually criticize a woman who was walking outside with her breasts exposed because the nipple has been freed, so to speak, in the city of New York, right? If you were to criticize that, you'd get fined for it. Fun fact, you may not have known. Yes, if you criticize women for being naked in public in the city of New York, you will have a charge levied against you in 2021. So if you think it's not going to get to this case, to this point in the United States, I advise you to pull your head out of the sand. It absolutely, positively, beyond any shadow of a doubt will. Mark my words. And we see it happening here in Finland. Quote, establishing standards of identity, end quote, also lets government meddle in theological controversies that are none of its business, said the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Shaw, who directs church relations for the Lutheran Church Missouri, Synod, LCMS, and has known Pohjola for decades. Pohjola's church is an international partner of the LCMS. From a natural law and historic Western perspective, quote, the government isn't supposed to get into people's brains and tell them what's right and wrong to believe and say, what's right and wrong to believe and say, end quote. Shaw noted in a phone interview. Quote, that's not their realm. Their realm is in externals, things like protecting people in their bodies, go to war when necessary, and punish criminals. This is really what's at stake in the Pohjola case. Government has lost its moorings and doesn't know its purpose, end quote. And ain't that about the truth? Ain't that about the truth? By the way, Nicholas, proclaimer of Messiah, shalom, thank you for being here. He also corrects something I said here. He says that in the case of Jack Phillips, he was willing to make any cake ordered for anyone. He was only unwilling to make a custom cake for the marriage. And that's 100% accurate. So I appreciate you correcting the record there for the audience. And in case nobody's seen the live chat, now you guys have the record corrected by audio, But shalom, by the way, thank you for being here. And Honesty Angel as well, I see you here. Thank you for being here as well. After theological study in Finland and the United States, Pohjola's first congregation in Helsinki started with about 30 members, he says. It was only able to support him part-time at first. He remembered his wife accompanying the congregation's hymn singing on a piano while their firstborn daughter, a baby at the time, laid on a blanket at the floor nearby. Finland's state church began openly disobeying Christian theology. I really appreciate this author being so blunt with it because it's 100% facts. But writer, excuse me, not author. But Finland's state church began openly disobeying Christian theology concerning sex differences amid the global sexual revolution of the 1960s. So Christians alienated by the state churches, embrace of anti-Christian cultural demands, sought faithful pastors like Pohjola, who are known as confessional for adhering to historic Christian confessions. Here in America, we of course call that fundamentalist, but same thing. The resulting growth of his tiny congregation gradually led to establishing a seminary that dozens of missionary churches, which grew as the theologically unfaithful state church shrank. In 2013, same year Pope Francis was elected, fun fact, 25 of these new confessional congregations formed the Evangelical Lutheran Diocese of Finland. Today, that diocese oversees 45 congregations and missions and is training 64 pastors. Now, I feel a very strong particular way about church government, and so I do not agree with this idea of having a sort of a larger church body that is dictating what the local churches can do. I do believe in primacy of the local church, and I believe in reducing church government as much as possible, which is why I believe in a congregationalist system of government in the church, right? But that is a conversation for an episode of Unapologetics, so I will leave that there and just simply note it because I think it's important to note, but nonetheless. The growth has been accompanied by suffering, including persecution, first from Pohjola's own church. In 2009, Pohjola was awarded the theological journal, I'm totally going to pronounce this wrong, sorry, Godesdienst Sabre of Boldness Award, which is granted for, quote, conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, on behalf of the Holy Church of Christ while engaged in the confession of his pure gospel in the face of hostile forces and at the greatest personal risk, end quote. Let me say that one more time. Which is granted, quote, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity on behalf of the Holy Church of Christ while engaged in the confession of his pure gospel in the face of hostile forces and at the greatest personal risk, end quote. The award honored Pohjola with other faithful Finnish pastors for standing firm as Finland's state church sought civil charges against them. Yes, civil charges against them, right? Why? For refusing to disobey the Bible's commands that only men be sent to lead spiritual warfare as pastors. So this is something that Pohjola has been dealing with for quite some time. Obviously, it wasn't homosexuality at the time, but then he was, again, defending what the word has to say. The Bible's quite clear. You cannot have female clergy. And he defended that, and the church wanted him charged for it in 2009. Notice 2009, fast forward 12 years, and now people are being charged for actually being charged for holding Christian beliefs. This is why I point out things like the California law, the Jax Phillips case, Tony Spell in Louisiana, and say, give it some time. We're only behind Europe by a decade. It'll come. It'll come. We're seeing the signs now. The flower is blooming. It's just not blossomed yet. And it's a disgusting and rotten flower. Like Luther before him, Pohjola was expelled by his own church body in 2014 for adhering to God's word on this matter. Ironically, a Lutheran body. The notice of his discharge declared Pohjola was obviously unfit to be a pastor. Listening to the scripture means you are obviously unfit to be a pastor. Anyways, at the time, he responded with grief, but also by saying that he must obey God rather than men. Amen. Lamenting, quote, instead of the church being purged with God's word, she is being purged from God's word, end quote. And what a quote that is. Instead of the church being purged with God's word, she is being purged from God's word. That is the unfortunate truth of the modern Western church. In the interview last week, Pohjola said being defrocked from his baptismal church grieves him to this day. On his mother's side, Pohjola said his family includes Lutheran pastors in the church going back to the 17th century Reformation. That's a little bit anachronistic. The Reformation actually occurred in the 16th century, the 1500s. 17th century would be the 1600s. But regardless, not important. But he could not disobey God's commands to retain his social status or employment. Perhaps what they meant is that it's back to the 17th century that it had happened, but that would still be anachronistic in calling that the Reformation. At any rate, division or unity? Yes, I agree with that. Pohjola's separation from Finland's state church also had the consequence of uniting him and his flock with other confessional Christians across the globe. Amen. The International Lutheran Council is a global network of theologically unified churches, and like the confessional churches in Finland, the network is growing. And again, I don't really like the whole governmental aspect that they have here, but it is nice at least to see Christians unifying with each other. But I just wish they wouldn't do so in this governmental structure, this denominational structure that they like to set up. But I digress on that. Matthew Block, the ILC's communication manager, noted that the heightened contradictions between increasingly unnatural pagan practices and historic... Oh my goodness, I love this writer. She is absolutely fantastic. Anyways, and historic Christian teachings. I'm going to reread that. Matthew Block, the ILC's communication manager, noted that the heightened contradictions between increasingly unnatural pagan practices and historic Christian teachings are causing a global confessional realignment. It's forcing people to make a real decision about where they stand, rather than allowing them to inhabit the increasingly non-existent indecisive middle. This is affecting churches all over the world. While it means division in some areas, it also is leading to unity in others. For example, despite other important theological differences, all the world's largest Christian bodies agree with the doctrines of which the Finnish government is persecuting Pohjola, at least for now. That allows them to speak in chorus to government leaders. And again, I say at least for now. The Catholic Church, the World Council of Churches, the LDS Church, the SBC, they're very quickly going liberal. So you just give it some time. Already, many dozens of top religious leaders across the world have formally raised their concerns with Rasanen and Pohjola's prosecution, to the Finnish government and the United Nations. Several U.S. members of Congress have also asked U.S. agencies to take action against Finland for these human rights abuses. And just to name a couple who have talked about this here in the States, we've had Dr. David Wood, Dr. Michael Brown, Dr. James White, Rabbi Jonathan Cahn, amongst others, who have spoken up about this. Of course, we need to be sure that we're all speaking up about this, and that is what we are doing here today, of course. Quote, I encourage Roman Catholic ecclesiastical leaders and all those who care for souls to speak up and join hands and lock arms with us as we talk about the absolute necessity of our historic Christian values of one man, one woman marriage, and the freedom to be able to believe it, to say it, to publish books about it, and find practical ways through hospitality, education, and other social engagement to make societies strong that way, end quote, Shaw said. I think he is a Roman Catholic, which is why he points that out, or why he specifies Roman Catholics, right? Quote, all churches, one could even say all religions, but in particular the Roman Catholic faith, this reflects their historic commitments as well, end quote. Now, really quickly, I do want to say we cannot, and this is something that Dr. James White has warned about for quite some time. I totally agree with him. We cannot let the unity which we have in certain areas, namely our right to speak freely, our right to practice our faith freely. We cannot let the unity we have in those issues create a false unity in other issues. In other words, this is a conversation more for the other channel, but if you're a Protestant Christian, you do not have the same faith as a Catholic. That's just a fact. And each of you mutually anathematize the other, right? So you just simply cannot have that kind of unity where you're in communion with each other. It's just simply not honest. And frankly, I think it will lead to a lot of problems, considering the fact that the globalists are very, very actively trying to seek a United Nations for all religions, as we have pointed out numerous times on this program. By the way, really quickly here, I just noticed I'm at 68 minutes. We are going to be talking about other things besides this, but nonetheless, please do like and share this video. Please consider subscribing if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time we go live, and let me go ahead and get back into the article. Actually, I'm gonna post the rest of this article in the live chat for you guys, and we're gonna get to some other stuff because we are limited on time. But you've got the general gist. You've got the point. The man has been being persecuted for the faith. He's been persecuted now for quite some time, and here we are, it happening in Finland, and it's going to happen here in America as well, barring a miracle of the Lord himself, barring some intervention from God himself, I would think. But nonetheless, that's the end of that segment. Finland begins formal persecution of Christians. Let's get into our next point, which is the headliner. Recapping COP26. Okay, So the article here is Green Matters, which is a progressive website, which is a well, I'll just come out and say it's socialist website, right? So we are going to have to take what we're going to read here next with a little bit of a grain of salt. But there are very few articles actually just recapping in total the COP26 conference. There are certain things I'm just going to skip over entirely because Green Matters is providing an opinion that I find ridiculous. I will comment on those things briefly, but I'm not going to read them. And we're just going to get to recapping what actually occurred here at the COP26 conference, which, of course, we talked briefly about after the first day, which is the most important day. But now that the whole conference has finished and been finished for some time, 17 days to be precise, we want to definitely get to that as well. And here's another article, by the way, that is talking about those highlights. So nonetheless. All right. After 2 weeks of speeches, discussions, negotiations, and protests, COP26 is finally wrapping up. But was anything actually accomplished at the 2021 UN Climate Change Conference? Let me add my own little point here and say I certainly hope not. But let's go ahead and look into that. Unfortunately, my hope is dashed. Although you will see here, not enough was done to satiate the vampires that make up the green movement. But we'll get into that. If you ask the climate activists who attended, they'd likely tell you no. But if you ask the governmental leaders who made sweeping promises at the summit, they'd likely pat themselves on the back. And if you asked those like me, then I would say that I think they did entirely too much, right? But nonetheless, here's a look back at some of the COP26 highlights and lowlights from the past 26 weeks. Now, here, of course, you see our semi-sapient bowl of pudding in chief, Joe Biden. Fun fact, if you say Joe Biden's first name in Spanish, it's actually Kamala. A few of you will get that, but not very many. Here, then, also, you have the General Secretary of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who is both Jesuit and Catholic, of course. He has to be Catholic in order to be Jesuit. He's also a socialist. And he has been on record saying that he wants to have a UN 2.0 that, in his words, is multilateralism with teeth, right? Meaning with the ability to enforce itself upon others. And then you have this lovely little failure here from lowercase Britain, Boris Johnson, who many such as myself thought was actually going to be somewhat of a godsend to the UK, turned out to just be nothing more than a sniveling jellyfish. And of course, you can see here being real buddy-buddy with some of the most disgusting and repugnant people in the free world. But nonetheless, there's our good pal Boris there. And actually, to be fair, in hindsight, as it turns out, Boris was a pretty terrible person to everybody in his immediate life, including his former wives. Yes, I said wives, and also children. I didn't know that, but as it turns out, that was something that was the case. And you know, had we been looking into that the way that we should be, it would have become obvious that he is absolutely somebody who cannot be trusted. But nonetheless, world leaders made a pledge to end deforestation. On Tuesday, November 2nd, leaders from 110 nations signed a joint pledge promising to end deforestation by 2030. With a budget of $19.2 billion, BBC News reported. Just a second. Sorry. Quote, "We commit to working collectively to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030 while delivering sustainable development and promoting an inclusive rural transformation," end quote. They wrote as per COP26 website. The pledges, signatories include the US, the UK, Denmark, Turkey, Canada, Italy, Japan, Colombia, Mexico, Russia, and most surprisingly, Brazil, where most of the Amazon rainforest and endless never-ending deforestation is located, which that's obviously the Nicholas says he's the Trump of the UK. Then that's 100% accurate. Boris is absolutely the Trump of the UK. But anyways, also the joke there, finished as in finish, that was also pretty funny. But I digress. Green Matters is adding their own opinion here. I think the Amazonian rainforest deforestation claims are very, very highly exaggerated. I say that as somebody who actually does have a good deal of care for certain aspects of environmentalism, and that is one of them. Obviously, the climate change stuff is nonsense, but it is true that we should care for the planet God has given us. It's his planet, not ours. And That said, the idea that lumber, that lumber companies are, cutting down all these trees and just decimating forests is just absolutely not true. These companies rely on there being a product to sell, namely the wood. They have an active stake, in making sure that these forests are replenished. And so, as a result, these companies in the United States and Canada and Brazil and Russia, so on and so forth, they do actually plant when they destroy. I'm sure that's not true in every country. I'm sure countries like, for example, China probably don't care very much for that kind of a thing. But the vast majority of countries actively replace the lumber that they quote destroy, right? Because of course they do. Of course they do. They want that product to be available for them, a couple years down the line when they need to sell it again. It doesn't make any sense for them to just diminish the entire forest and not replenish it with anything. They'd go out of business within a decade, right? But nonetheless, there was this pledge to end deforestation that is not even really happening, and which capitalism and companies that are involved in the lumber industry were already solving, because it was happening at one point in time. That certainly is the case. Back in the day, there certainly was a lot of deforestation going on, but we've kind of gotten that kind of stuff under wraps. And by the way, that's a common thing we have here. There was freshwater problems back in the day. There's not anymore. There was trash problems back in the day. There's not anymore. Nuclear waste problems back in the day. There's not anymore. The market itself fixes a lot of the legitimate environmental problems, right? When it comes to the non-legitimate environmental problems like climate change, there's nothing to fix. So of course the market doesn't fix them. But the point is, if there is an actual problem, the market fixes it, not the government, right? But at any rate, if there's ever been a moment to sarcastically state, I'll believe it when I see it, that moment is now, says the Green Matters writer. We're not going to get to this next part because it's incredibly dumb. But the Green Matters writer complains, that COP26 menus offered many animal products. And woe is this person. I mean, I don't know. It's as if we haven't been drinking milk and eating meat for, since the dawn of time. I even sympathize with vegetarians. It is weird for me personally, the whole idea of eating meat. It's certainly not with vegans. I would never give up cream unless God himself told me to, or if I was like a threat to my life, right? But I digress. The idea that like this is like something that we need to force on other people, or that it's causing climate change. I mean, it's stupid. We have been literally farming cows for thousands of years. We have been farming cows since before we have been writing stuff down. That's just a matter of established fact. Okay. So the idea that we are somehow causing climate change by virtue of farming cows and serving them to people in a burger is dumb, stupid, not smart, the opposite of intelligent. How many different ways would you like me to say it? Forrest Gump if you knock down the IQ point by maybe half, right? But at any rate, we're not going to read that because it's stupid and not worth our time. Around 20 major countries pledged to stop funding overseas fossil fuel projects because even though fossil fuels have been very firmly established to be the single best fuel we have, barring nuclear, which everybody's terrified of, doesn't matter. We're going to get rid of that and try and force people into these unproven technologies that have much less of a caloric outtake, which means they don't put out as much energy for how much you're putting in, right? Such as solar power, such as hydropower, such as electropower. But whatever, it's fine. Doesn't matter. Government just needs to ruin everything perpetually. At any rate, on Thursday, November 4th, around 20 countries came together at COP26 and signed a joint pledge to stop paying for overseas oil, gas, and coal projects by the end of 2022, as reported by CNN. All those jobs be damned. All that energy that is necessary to make sure that you have a heated home and a cooked meal and that is going to get people in the third world out of poverty. All that be damned. Why? Well, because we don't like you using fossil fuels. We think it causes climate change, greenhouse effects, and blah, 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 blah. Vomit, puke all over my shoes, dust that crap off. It's disgusting. Doesn't matter. And people, by the way, this kind of a stupid, mind-numbingly evil plan. Why do I call it evil? Because of the thing I'm about to say. It will kill people. It will kill people. People think that I'm over-exaggerating when I say that the climate change policies that people want to put out there will kill people. Okay, if you're in the third world and you have a choice between getting your energy from fossil fuels or coal or not having energy to power your grid at all, and then outside forces come and say, sorry, you can't do that, or at least we're not going to help you do that. We'll help you do everything else that you can't actually accomplish, right? That is going to get people killed. Why? Because they can't power their grid. What do you think powering the grid does, right? It makes sure that your homes are heated. It makes sure that you have gas in your stove. It makes sure that you have the ability to commute over large distances, such as, for example, helping somebody who may or may not be living in a village that is a large deal of time away from the nearest hospital. It helps the hospital themselves. These things are incredibly important, and people die when you tell the third world they cannot pull themselves out of poverty, out of this horrible living conditions that they are currently living in, because you don't like this imaginary effect that fossil fuels have. And so, yeah, for us, it may not be deadly, although I still think it would be in certain instances. Absolutely. I think we take for granted just how awesome our life currently is here in the States. But for people in the third world, for the impoverished, absolutely, this will get them killed. It's not disputable. It's a fact. It will get them killed. Mark my words. And by the way, it also eliminates millions upon millions upon millions of jobs all across the world. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and I could be wrong about this, but if I'm not mistaken, in the United States alone, there are something like 2 million people employed in the fossil fuel industry. That is a lot of mouths to feed. Right? Every one of those people has people relying on them, or at least most of them do. So it's even greater than 2 million people who are relying on the income established for them by the fossil fuel industry. Does that matter? No, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. What does matter? The greenhouse effect, bro. Stupid. While this agreement is certainly not a bad thing, you got me fooled, it's not necessarily as good as it sounds, says the hippie writing this article. If these countries, which include the US and UK, replace I'm going to start calling that the UQ, actually. I think that, unfortunately, Britain, lowercase Britain, is, how do I put this? Well, I won't be crass about it. They don't have enough chutzpah to be known as a kingdom. I think we're going to start calling them the United Queendom, but nonetheless. The UQ, the US and the UQ, replace the energy they would have been harvesting abroad with renewable energy. Well, that's great. But if the US, but if they, I don't know why I read the US, but if they simply turn this into a new excuse to find ways to harvest more fossil fuels domestically, well, that will just further hurt the environment and people in these countries, which of course is not true, but whatever. Oh, well, the latter part is true. The latter part is true. Because if the effect of this is we simply will not be dealing with third world countries who sell fossil fuels, then obviously they are going to be having the negative effect of not getting any income, having a bunch of jobs lost, all that, and the overall impact on the fossil fuel industry will be practically nothing, because all of the first world countries will just be using their own fossil fuels and trading amongst each other, right? So that part is true. But as far as the damage done to the environment, that was just a bunch of nonsense. All right, next, what happened? Greta Thunberg led a school strike outside of COP26. Obviously, I cannot stand Greta Thunberg, but I don't know. I will say I do think people are a little bit degrading with Greta, and I don't like that. So I'm going to go ahead and just not address any of that, or not approach any of that. And acknowledge the fact that it does exist, because it is. I don't like that, but nonetheless, she is still an absolute clown. And she led a protest on November the 5th. So on Friday, November 5th, Fridays for Future Glasgow, held a climate strike outside of COP26, which drew more than 30,000 protesters, according to Greta Thunberg, which, she may or may not be telling the truth. And as noted by the New York Times, indigenous activists and activists from developing countries actually led the protests in hopes of shining a light on how the climate crisis disproportionately impacts their communities, which I think that they have been led to believe that that's the case. So in some instances, it is the case, just because in a lot of countries, you have these. Well, basically, the long and short of it is that these people don't actually have full rights, unfortunately. Even today in 2021, that's a big problem for indigenous peoples in New Zealand and Canada, and even here in the United States, Australia, so on and so forth. For them having their rights to their land, stuff like that, right? And just to give you an example of how this can be relevant to the conversation here, right? If you have land such as, for example, the land that the Dakota Access Pipeline was supposed to pass through, right? But you don't really have the rights to tell the government, no, you can't actually do this, or yes, you can actually do this. Then essentially what you have is an area here that we can just, oh, well, if we don't actually need the go-ahead of the locals here, we need the go-ahead of the locals everywhere else, but we don't need the go-ahead of the locals here, so we can just blaze right through this particular area, and whatever they happen to say is just not relevant, right? Whatever they happen to want for their own community, it just doesn't matter. And so, unfortunately, that is a real problem. And so there's some level of truth to the idea that certain environmental policies impact indigenous people more than other what would you say, policies, or more than other peoples, excuse me. However, it is also true that indigenous peoples from across the globe have been convinced, I think, by very clever marketing, if you will, very clever propaganda, have been convinced that it is a matter of their identity to defend the environment and to fight back against things, quote unquote, like climate change, right? Even if it was true, the idea that it would have more of an impact on them than us is just completely ridiculous. We live in the same areas, right? So that's just absolute nonsense. In Thurnberg's speech at the protest, she called COP26 a failure. I would agree with her, but for completely different reasons. A PR event and a global North Greenwash festival. Which, to be fair, that's actually not wrong. The Global North Greenwash Festival aspect and the PR event too. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with her perception of this little event here, but nonetheless, obviously for different reasons. As seen in a video posted by Democracy Now! Quote, the most affected people in the most affected areas still remain unheard, and the voices of future generations are drowning, in their greenwash and empty words and promises. I like that term, greenwash. I'm going to have to steal that from you. Thank you, Miss Greta. Or Thurnberg, I guess I should say. Thunberg. There's no R there. Thunberg. Sorry. Thunberg declared in her speech, as per Democracy Now!, quote, but the facts do not lie, and we know that our emperors are naked. I agree with you, ma'am, that your emperors are naked, but if your emperors are on your side and they are naked, then what does that mean? That means your position is naked. So perhaps the boot is on your own foot, or however you would say that. I don't know. That's not how you say the saying, but I don't care. Continuing on. Barack Obama made a speech encouraging youth action, even though he's not the president anymore, but not like that matters. On Monday, November 8th, former President Barack Obama made his COP26 speech. He focused on the ways climate change efforts have failed and tried to inspire the next generation to take action. However, multiple young climate activists of color who attended COP26 expressed disappointment that they were not allowed to watch Obama's speech. Of course, has to point out that they're of color, right? Why? Because it fans the racial flames. But we're going to go ahead and ignore that because we do not want to fan the racial flames. I guess I probably even should just, anyways, it doesn't matter. Quote, BIPOC youth, I don't know what that means, but anyways, can't go to see Obama at the COP26 event, even though his speech is about youth engagement, because it's a private ticketed event for elite, end quote, intersectional environmentalist founder Leah Thomas tweeted that day. So in other words, this is one of those things where it's like, hey, I don't get the right to just freely waltz into any place I please, even though it costs a whole bunch of money to do something like this, right? I'm not going to contribute to any of that. I expect you, I demand you, in fact, to let me in for free, is basically what Ms. Thomas is saying here. But nonetheless, Obama made a speech, despite the fact that he's not the president anymore and everything he says literally doesn't matter. So that also happened at COP26. It was discovered that the fossil fuel industry had the most delegates at COP26, which of course they would. But we're going to go ahead and ignore that as well, because that's just basically a hit piece on the fossil fuel industry for having the audacity to defend itself. This interested me a lot. And the next point is going to be the most interesting thing on this article, but nonetheless, don't read ahead, don't cheat. Greta Thunberg and other activists asked the UN to declare a climate emergency. On Wednesday, November the 10th, a group of young climate activists, including Greta Thunberg, delivered a petition to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, as reported by Earther. Their demand that the UN formally declare a climate emergency. Unsurprisingly, the UN has yet to do so. I admire this person's honesty in saying yet to do so, because I think that she and I both know that it's going to happen in the future. But nonetheless, what exactly would declaring a climate emergency mean? It kind of depends. If the current UN is maintained, then it would basically mean nothing more than the UN said a thing, and that thing is contrary to the interests of individual nations which make up the UN, which is no different than what the UN does every single day, right? If Antonio Guterres gets his wish and the UN is replaced by a UN 2.0, or multilateralism with teeth, as he said, that's a quote, by the way, his direct quote, multilateralism with teeth, then that could obviously be a really big deal. That could, in some way lead us to a situation where there is UN peacekeepers enforcing the will of the UN because it's a, quote, emergency, right? Forcing the shutdown of fossil fuel plants, for example, and coal mines. I could certainly see something like that occurring if Antonio Guterres actually gets his way. Quote, the United Nations connects the entire world together, and we need global action on the climate crisis, end quote. Teenage activist Alexandria Villaseñor told Earther. Quote, in order to show great leadership, they have to declare a climate emergency, end quote. And we should definitely all listen to this teenager who absolutely knows what she's talking about. I shouldn't say that. I guess I started doing this as a teenager as well. So that's not reason enough to dismiss what she's saying. But what she stands for is dumb. So that is reason enough to dismiss what she's saying. And then this little gem was absolutely fantastic. The US and China signed a pledge to work together on climate goals. Yes, signed a pledge to work together. And really, it doesn't even matter what comes after that. The fact of the matter is the United States signed a pledge to work together with the communist government in China, which currently has people in concentration camps for having the audacity to be Muslim, to be ethnically Uyghur, to be supportive of Hong Kong or Tibetan rights, to be Christian, to be Falun Gong, and a whole bunch of other litanies, a whole bunch of other reasons, a whole litany of reasons, right? The U.S. decided, could you imagine if we were in 1940 and the U.S. signed a pledge to work with Nazi Germany on anything at all, anything. I don't care what it is. The development of a rocket to get to the moon, the development of a vaccine to stop polio, the development of a road to connect Europe and Asia or something. I don't care what it is. Would anybody on this entire planet look at that and be like, yeah, totally chill. That's cool. That's totally cool. Of course not. Of course not. What kind of nonsense is that? But here they are. Here they are. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. In fact, I personally believe that Biden probably is taking hush money from the Chinese. I think he's absolutely in their pocket, right? But yeah, here they are. Here they are signing a pledge to work together. And again, what they're working together on isn't even relevant. Isn't even relevant. The fact of the matter is that Joe Biden and this administration has decided they will work together with a regime that puts people in concentration camps, with a regime that sends soldiers to rape women so that they can try to deculturalize certain areas and make them more authentically Chinese and loyal to the state. That's not a joke. That's actually what's going on. That's actually what's going on. That's not an exaggeration. It's happening in China right now. And what does the United States government right now in 2021 have to say about it? Let's work together. Doesn't matter what we're working together on. Like, forget the fact that it's also we're working together on something that's absolute nonsense. It's absolute garbage, right? It'd be one thing if we were working together on something that actually meant something. That would still be a problem. That would still be disgusting. That would still be something that was worthy of condemnation. But excuse me. But here, we're not only having them work together, but having them work together on a problem that doesn't exist. And the reason why, by the way, if I can just be so bold, the reason why is because they both have the same agenda in mind, which is you, simple little peasant, being under their thumb. That's what they want. They want you to be seen as a serf, not as a citizen, a subject, not as the person who they are actually accountable to. But at any rate, also on Wednesday, November the 10th, representatives from both the United States and China, and China's governments, announced that they plan to work together on an agreement to ramp up their climate ambitions, as reported by CNN. The details are vague, and as CNN added, during the summit, both the U.S. and China refused to sign a statement pledging to eventually phase out coal. Needless to say, we're not impressed, says Green Times. And who cares what Green Times is impressed by, right? The fact of the matter is this is sign of absolutely detestable alliances to come. And probably not just with China. It'll probably extend to other people as well. We already have alliances with certain detestable folks, such as Saudi Arabia, and obviously Trump was making us a little bit more allied with North Korea. Ugh, a little bit of crumbs in there. Hate that happens. Regardless, so we'll just continue on with that because why not? I mean, apparently it only actually matters that somebody is putting somebody in concentration camps when it happened 75 some odd years ago. The Holocaust happened 76 years ago. But anyways, there's the article there for you guys if you want to read it for yourselves. Okay, next thing we want to talk about is Jelane Maxwell and her case. The first day of her case was today. And we want to go ahead and talk about what is happening in this case. Sorry, there's an ad here. So this is an article from the Daily Beast. And trigger warning, because some of the things we're going to talk about are explicit and detestable. And they definitely give you a little bit of a peek into how evil humanity actually is. So if that's not something you're interested in, perhaps the rest of this program is not for you. But I digress. Schoolgirl outfits, gifts to teens, and sex abuse every day. Feds slam Jelane Maxwell on first day of trial. Call it a pyramid scheme of abuse. Prosecutors vowed to expose Jelane Maxwell as Jeffrey Epstein's best friend and right hand, who allegedly lured teen girls into his sex trafficking ring. And by the way, really quickly, I'd like to note, this is a common tactic amongst sexual abusers in numerous different ways, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. If you look at people who have things like casting couches in modeling, pornography, and other entertainment industries like Hollywood and stuff, a lot of times they like to have women with them, especially other female actors, right, or actresses, right, obviously, to try and make it seem a little bit more, basically try and make the person who they're trying to scheme into having sex with them a little bit more comfortable, right? Because women are obviously more comfortable around other women, right? If a woman, especially an older woman with status, is here telling you that this is all fine and it's all dandy and it's perfectly good and kind of leading you and luring you into it, it makes you a little bit more, as a woman, susceptible to the manipulation at play, right? Because of the fact that you are more comfortable with, as a woman, as somebody of your own gender, especially as it pertains to sexual issues, right? You see that, like I said, here in these cases with the high-ranking actresses. You see that in grooming gangs, where they will tend to have prostitutes actually approach the girls, and then the grooming is done only after the prostitutes have convinced the girls to come back with them. You see this very frequently in even things like pornography, right? Even things like pornography, where you have very young women doing their first shoots in the presence of older, more well-established women. And even in cases of individual abuse, it's still very common to find that rapists and serial rapists actually have a female co-conspirator. It's not like an unbelievably common thing, don't get me wrong, but it's common enough to note. And usually when there is that female co-conspirator, they are used in the self-same way that Jelane Maxwell is being accused of being used here, which is as a way to make the young victims, and obviously almost always female, a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more relaxed, have their, what's the word there? inhibitions a little bit more squashed, so to speak, right? So a very common tactic, and it wouldn't be surprising at all to know that Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein were using that very well-known sexual abuse tactic. Regardless, they were young girls who dreamed of becoming professional musicians, models, or actresses, but they often came from poor families and their parents needed money. They were the perfect targets for a pair of high society predators who dazzled them with fabulous wealth and promised them the world, and who then allegedly groomed, molested, and raped them. Such was the story presented by federal prosecutors on the first day of Ghislaine Maxwell's trial in connection to multimillionaire Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking ring. The 59-year-old British heiress is accused of procuring underage girls for Epstein to molest in what prosecutors called a pyramid scheme of abuse. 4 victims will testify that Maxwell participated in Epstein's sex ring, including one who says the couple involved her in group sexualized massages when she was only 14 years old. That is prepubescent, just so you guys are clear on that. Maxwell has denied these charges. The jury will hear from Epstein's pilots, household staff, members of law enforcement, and a former employee of the multimillionaire. Evidence in the trial will include, quote, a schoolgirl outfit, end quote, flight logs, and FedEx records showing Epstein's gifts to a girl who was only 15 years of age, which is still likely prepubescent. Though I guess you could be done with your pubescency stage at that point. Not that that justifies it, of course, but I think we all kind of inherently recognize that there is something a little bit worse about having sex with a currently pubescent or prepubescent girl versus a post-pubescent teenager. Again, not to justify anything, but I think we all would agree that there are levels of problematicness, if you will, in this situation. And by the way, really quickly, let me say this is absolutely related to the Epstein case, or excuse me, to the Weinstein case. And it's also absolutely related to the way that we view women in the modern day. Okay. Because you have to understand, if it wasn't for the fact that these women were 14 and 15 years old, these girls, I should say, were 14 and 15 years old, this wouldn't even be a case, right? In other words, if you start dazzling young girls, and in some cases, these girls can be as young as 16 because that's the age of consent in a lot of states, and you dazzle them with things like wealth and parts in movies and stuff like that, and you know, they decide to accept, not only is that perfectly legal, which, to be frank, you shouldn't make it illegal if somebody's going to willingly choose to have sex with you for money. Well, let me rephrase that. If somebody's going to willingly choose to have sex with you for money, it shouldn't be something where only the person who paid or only the person who provided some kind of a incentive is punished. Both parties are equally accountable if they are both consenting adults under the law, right? That being said, though, if it wasn't for the fact that we saw that kind of a thing as something that's perfectly fine in this culture, right, then these kinds of things wouldn't happen. And if it wasn't for the fact that these girls are 14 and 15 years old, we would see this as perfectly fine. Maybe a little bit piggish, but certainly not a crime. Certainly not something that makes somebody detestable. And I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem in our culture. We need to get back to a point where we view women as more than simply sexual objects, right? 100 years of feminism, and we now live in a culture that has more sexualized women than any other culture before it, including cultures that had things like temple prostitution. Not even close, actually. Not even close. Maxwell's lawyers hit back, claiming she was being scapegoated for Epstein's crimes, which to a certain extent is true. I think she was involved, but obviously they whacked Epstein and then kind of used her as a patsy, is sort of what I feel. But nonetheless, quote, ever since Eve was accused of tempting Adam with the apple. Oh, my goodness. Of course, the lawyer here who is defending the serial rapist is going to accuse the Bible of being sexist in the course of defending this detestable scumbag. But anyways, ever since Eve was accused of tempting Adam with the apple, women are blamed for the bad behavior of men, end quote, said defense lawyer Bobby Steinem on Monday. Quote, the charges against Ghislaine Maxwell for the things Jeffrey Epstein did, but she is not Jeffrey Epstein. She is not like Jeffrey Epstein. She is not like any other powerful men, moguls, media giants who abuse women, end quote. Now, that's just not true, okay? And, of course, you can see the wokery kind of happening here. I hope it doesn't work. But essentially, the idea is you're just blaming this woman because of your misogyny, and not actually holding the man accountable for his own actions. Now, of course, there's a lot of problems with this, not least of which is the fact that Jeffrey Epstein is now dead. But on top of that, much more importantly, if Jelane Maxwell was involved in the sex trafficking, then she's equally accountable. That's just a fact. If you think that's not a fact, you need your head examined. Okay? If you are actively involved in grooming young girls, even if you did not actively have sex with those young girls, which, by the way, she is accused of doing, okay? But even if you didn't do that, you were still involved in grooming them and luring them and getting them there and getting them raped. That's a fact. That's a fact. And as I said earlier, these kinds of crimes, death penalty. Not on the table as the only thing that is on the table. If you're found guilty, we're executing you. Period. Period. End of the conversation. Now, of course, you can't do that because of the Supreme Court's absolutely bogus rulings 1977 and 2003 that say you're actually not allowed to execute rapists and pedophiles because that's considered cruel and unusual punishment by the absolutely batshit insane people who run our country, excuse my French. But let's be perfectly clear, in a functioning justice system, if she is found guilty of this, she would be executed. And I think that she likely should be executed because I think she's guilty of it. But nonetheless. Maxwell's lawyers hit back. I already said that, sorry. In the 1990s, Maxwell was known as Epstein's socialite girlfriend who connected the up-and-comer to rich and powerful pals, including Prince Andrew, who has been accused of participating in the sordid sex ring, which he likely did. I mean, I'm being honest. I find the evidence convincing, but nonetheless. The royals claim he's innocent. Later victims say Maxwell allegedly served as the financier's madam, recruiting schoolgirls, to give him erotic massages and grooming them for abuse. Prosecutors called Maxwell Epstein's best friend and right hand, in court on Monday. Quote, she preyed on vulnerable young girls, manipulated them, and served them up to be abused. This is what this trial is all about, end quote, said Assistant U.S. Attorney Laura Pomerantz, who, she claimed Maxwell was drawn to Epstein's life of luxury, which included sumptuous private homes in New Mexico, New York, and Paris, a private island, private planes, and astounding wealth. And of course, the love of money is the root of all evil, says the scriptures. But nonetheless, there's that. The enigmatic Epstein reportedly reminded many people of Maxwell's own troubled and charismatic father, Robert Maxwell, a newspaper magnate whose life swirled with rumors of connection to foreign spy agencies, who swindled his employees out of their pensions, and who died ere a mysterious accident off his yacht, the Lady Jelane, which is somewhat interesting considering he named her daughter, Jelane, right? But at any rate, not interesting in the case, but just interesting in general. Robert Maxwell left his family in massive debt, but Epstein helped Jelane regain and maintain the lifestyle to which she was accustomed, prosecutors say. Jelane Maxwell arrived in court on Monday looking put together and demure, sporting a cream-colored sweater and simple black slacks. She waved happily at her sister Isabel, who was on hand for the proceedings and took copious notes. The socialite's demeanor in stark, oh my goodness, one more time. The socialite's demeanor stood in stark contrast to earlier appearances in court when she looked gaunt and disheveled and when her team accused jail guards of mistreating her, which may or may not be true, I don't know. She wore a face mask that often slid below her nose as the prosecutors delivered opening remarks from inside a plexiglass box in a nod to COVID-19 protocols. Oh my goodness, the entire world is insane. But the accusations that prosecutors laid out against Maxwell were anything but staid. Maxwell would allegedly take teen girls on shopping trips, win their trust, and even escort them into the room where Epstein would molest them. She ordered Epstein's employees to hear nothing, see nothing, say nothing in a culture of silence. One victim will testify that Maxwell and Epstein approached her when she was 14 and at a summer camp, for talented kids. It was the beginning of a nightmare in which they allegedly abused her for 4 years. Epstein abused underage girls like her every single day, prosecutors say. He would start with sexualized massages, then proceed to penetration and oral rape. Sometimes they say Maxwell was in the room when the abuse took place. Sometimes they say she touched the girls herself. But this is just misogyny, right? It's just misogyny, friends. This is just poor woman being blamed for all of the problems of the powerful men in the patriarchy. Vile, disgusting. Epstein and Maxwell committed their crimes together, the prosecution claims. She was allegedly always on the lookout for new victims. One girl was 17 when she was spotted in a parking lot by Maxwell, who recruited her out of the blue, prosecutors say. Girls also were encouraged to recruit other underage teens in exchange for cash. Maxwell's lawyers plan to push back on these allegations by questioning the victims' memories and motives. Quote, this case is about memory manipulation and money, end quote, defense lawyer Steinem said, adding that the accuser's memories have faded over time and were corrupted by things over the years, including victims' lawyers seeking a big jackpot of money and by media reports. I don't personally know how your memory could be corrupted to the point of creating a person inside of the room touching you in places they should not be touching you, when in fact that did not happen. I'm just saying. Jelane Maxwell looks a heck of a lot different than Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, if you're just going to make the claim they just made that up because their memories fade, whatever, that's on you, right? But there ain't no jury that's in its sane right mind that's going to buy that. Now, I don't know if this jury will be in its sane and right mind. I guess we'll see. But nonetheless, she said that attorneys saw Epstein and Maxwell as easy targets for lawsuits and noted that the accuser, who says she was groomed at age 14, didn't want to participate in the criminal case against Epstein, changing her mind later and asking for money from a victims fund set up by his estate. Quote, she received $5 million, examined critically what she is going to say on the stand, end quote, Steinem said. And by the way, if there is some level of financial incentive, obviously that's important to note. Obviously, it's also important to note that if she was actually victimized, then there should be some financial compensation. So obviously there's, that's a little bit of a catch-22 there, but I digress. Maxwell's lawyers also argued that sex acts Epstein engaged in occurred when some alleged victims were of the age of consent, which that is actually going to be true of the 17-year-old. She at the time would have been past the age of consent in her area, which would have been 16. But nonetheless, Steinem said that when one girl allegedly got a massage at Epstein's New Mexico ranch, she was of age in the state, and she will still receive $1.5 million from the victim's fund. The defense has also claimed that another alleged victim in Britain was of the age of consent there. The judge in that case has agreed to limit the woman's testimony as a result. And to be fair, even though it's still detestable what is happening, or what had happened, I should say. Obviously, if you're past the age of consent, then you can't be charged on the basis that you could not have given consent, right? At that point, somebody could only charge the other person in the sexual act if it was like penetrative or if they were somehow incapacitated or something along those lines, right? So, while we may not enjoy the fact that Jeffrey Epstein certainly got away with grooming and having sex with 16 and 17-year-old girls, the fact of the matter is the law in the majority of places in the world, the majority of states in this country even, is that once you are age 16, you have passed the legal age of consent. So that is important to note. Steinem called into question the motives of that woman and another alleged victim dubbed Kate and Caroline in court. She claimed Kate was a jet-setting British actress who dated an Oxford classmate of Maxwell's who was twice her age, and she communicated with Epstein for a decade after the alleged abuse, including sending him photos of herself while he was in jail. Steinem said Kate got $3.25 million from the victim's fund. And of course, if that in particular is true, then that would mean her testimony would certainly come into question. Caroline, she said, filed 2 lawsuits against Epstein and one of his assistants, Sarah Kellen, which never named Maxwell as a defendant. Steinem said the evidence will show Caroline groomed and trafficked girls for Epstein, which doesn't actually necessarily change anything. In fact, it likely only makes the situation worse because it would demonstrate that Caroline was not only herself likely groomed as a young girl, but it would also demonstrate that Epstein was then using women, which Jelane Maxwell, of course, is, to go back and groom other young girls. So I don't know how the defense actually thinks that is a defense, but let's continue. After he died, her lawyer contacted the government and she finally implicated Maxwell. Caroline received $3.5 million from the fund. The victims have been impacted by lawyers, by media, by things they have heard, and by money, big bucks, Steinem said. I would point out that since they've actually already gotten the money, there is no incentive for them to continue to lie as far as monetary incentive is concerned, right? They already have the money. The money can't be taken back. So for them to continue on with the lie at this point would be pointless. So I just want to point out there's a flaw in the defense's argumentation there as well. Quote, until now, even though they got money from a fund, their words have been unchallenged, end quote. Notice they got money from a fund. So once again, it's just simply irrelevant to say that they were having some kind of financial incentive, because there is no longer financial incentive, and yet they are still pursuing this avenue, right? So the only thing that they could have here is potentially, the only thing that they would have here is potentially a vendetta against Jelane herself, if she was indeed innocent, right? But you can't say that the monetary incentive is actually relevant any longer, because again, it's already been fulfilled. Epstein's predations first came to light a decade ago when scores of teen girls told Florida police that he routinely molested them at his Palm Beach hideaway in exchange for cash. The powerful money man, who counted Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, Woody Allen, and Harvey Weinstein amongst his pals. Let me say that again. Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, Woody Allen, and Harvey Weinstein, and who often partied with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, right? So this dude was rolling with the big honchos, was given a sweetheart deal at the time. He pleaded guilty to one count of soliciting underage prostitution and served a light sentence in a county jail with a lenient work release program. That's not a joke, by the way. That actually happened. His lawyers also arranged a controversial non-prosecution agreement for Epstein's fellow unnamed co-conspirators. So we live in a world where it's illegal and unconstitutional to execute Jeffrey Epstein for what he did, but it's perfectly fine and normal to put him in a what essentially amounts to a vacation home that you can't leave for a year. Totally cool, totally normal. Lord help us. Lord help us. But Epstein was again arrested in July 2019 by New York authorities and charged with exploiting dozens of underage girls in a sexual pyramid scheme. At the time of his arrest, authorities found a safe filled with precious gems, piles of cash, and fake passports at his Upper East Side palace, along with a trove of sexual photos of girls. He killed himself a month later while awaiting trial. And of course, anybody with a functioning brain knows that he definitely did not kill himself. But, you know, the overwhelming majority of Americans do not actually have a functioning brain, unfortunately. So there's that. A year later, Maxwell was nabbed by the FBI at a secluded mansion in New Hampshire, where she was hiding out with her much younger secret husband, tech CEO Scott Borgerson. She remains the only accomplice of Epstein to face charges in connection with his trafficking ring, because she is a patsy. That's absolutely true. Though French authorities have also arrested Epstein's close friend and modeling scout Jean-Luc Brunel, who stands accused of raping underage girls and trafficking them to Epstein. So there you have it. That's the first day of the trial, which was today. We will continue to, Lord willing, be keeping up with this trial. I'm going to go ahead and drop the link in the live chat for you guys here. But nonetheless, this is obviously a very important thing going on. And hopefully justice is served in this instance. I notice Nicholas says these cases seem to be very mild in contrast to those victims who are not able to testify due to captivity or death. Am I mistaken to think they are recharacterizing the matter to seem less atrocious? And you are not, Brother Nicholas. They absolutely have. There was a point in time, back when the media was being honest about this, there was a point in time where they were actually referring to the Lolita Express as Epstein's personal sex trafficking private jet, where they were referring to his island as a child sex ring, and saying, you know, calling it a rape island, basically a private sex island for abuse, right, and stuff like that. Now they are seemingly, talking about this situation in ways that, while they're still certainly terrible, are a lot less terrible than having, a whole bunch of wealthy people going to a private island where kidnapped girls are being abused. And of course, emphasis on girls, right? Not women. But I digress there. One last thing we want to talk about real quickly, guys. If you are seeing that I'm going to be going live on the other channel, I will still be going live, but it's going to be a little bit later than originally anticipated. But we're going to talk very briefly about the one good thing that we have today, because everything we've talked about today so far has kind of been terrible. And that is that Pastor Artur Pawlowski of Canada has actually found some justice in the Canadian courts. Thank the Lord above for this. Let me go ahead and briefly edit the time that I have on here. Sorry about that, friends. But nonetheless, Artur Pawlowski has, believe it or not, won in the Alberta Court of Appeals. He has found justice, and it just goes to show that even in communist Canada, it is still possible for justice to be served, and that we do serve an awesome and living God. Court of Appeals suspends punishment of Pastor Artur Pawlowski. This is from Lake Superior News, which is a local news agency in Canada. From Northern Ontario, November 25th, 2021, Alberta's Court of Appeals has lifted the compelled speech punishment that Justice Adam Germain placed on Pastor Artur Pawlowski. Moments ago, Justice Jelane Maxwell, of the Alberta Court of Appeal threw out the bizarre, unconstitutional, Soviet-style sentence that a lower court judge had imposed on Pastor Artur Pawlowski, his brother Dawid Pawlowski, and Whistle Stop Cafe owner Chris Scott. Effective immediately, they no longer have to denounce themselves after any criticism of the government's lockdowns. The bizarre order that they were forced to say official government propaganda, after every time they criticized the government. Yes, no joke. They were forced to say official government propaganda after every time they criticized the government. Not kidding. Was part of an abusive anti-Christian sentence meted out last month, by Justice Adam Germain. Germain is a failed Liberal candidate appointed to the courts as a patronage payoff by Jean Chrétien. And it shows. And of course, we're dealing with the same thing here in the United States with the Honorable Attorney General Merrick Garland. This is not the end of the battle. The full appeal is still to come, which that is definitely true, right? We don't want to be overexcited here, but nonetheless, we do want to take the wins and glorify the Lord when they come. This is not the end of the battle. The full appeal is still to come, but it immediately freezes the most abusive parts of it, and that was the only was only possible because of you. And this is the person talking to his audience, but I'm going to read it because I agree. You and other freedom-oriented citizens like you banded together to crowdfund top lawyers for these three men, and without that, Justice Germain's thuggery would have ruled the day. So thank you for your help, but the battle is not over. And I'm going to repeat that again for my audience, right? If you guys are out here talking about this, sharing this video, financially contributing, sharing other people's videos and financially contributing to them, praying, of course, because we serve a living and active God, then you are to be thanked. Then you are to be thanked because you are actively helping us fight back against the detestable people who currently control our country and indeed our world, right? So I want to reiterate the thanks that the article writer gave here. The main Court of Appeal hearing will happen on June 14th, 2022. Mark your calendars, friends. Again, that is June 14th, 2022. One more time, June 14th, 2022. That is when we are going to have the main Court of Appeal hearing for Pastor Artur Pawlowski. Mark that in your calendars this day. The good news is that those abusive parts of the ruling will be suspended until then. Pastor Artur, his brother Dawid, and Chris won an important battle today, and I'm starting to think maybe they'll win the whole war next June. And of course, we can hope. We can hope. This would have been impossible without top-notch lawyers. If you haven't had a chance to chip in yet, please do, because we still have to go one more round against these bullies in June. Please click here or go to www.saveartur.com. By the way, that's Artur without the H, A-R-T-U-R, www.saveartur.com. All donations to this civil liberties battle will receive a charitable tax receipt from the Democracy Fund, a registered Canadian charity. I'm going to go ahead and share the link there for you guys, and it's to a website you should definitely be listening to if you're in Canada. That would be Rebel News, and I'm also going to go ahead and drop the very short article into the live chat for you as well. So that's the end of that. That's the end of our show for today. I wanted to just go ahead and share that little bit of positive news with you guys, because obviously we want to take our wins where we have them, and that is absolutely something to glorify the Lord for. Of course, we glorify the Lord in all things. He is sovereign regardless. But obviously, this is just yet another example of him caring for his flock. And, I definitely want to rejoice in the gift he has given us here today. So with that, friends, we're going to go ahead and get out of here and end this program. If you liked this episode, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time we go live. I am trying to make sure I go live Monday, Wednesday, Friday. It has yet to be done successfully on this channel, but nonetheless, we will continue to try. This week seems obviously to be going well because we started our Monday off solidly, but let's see where it goes. Definitely hit that bell to get notified every time we go live. Obviously, if you guys want to follow me on different social media platforms, you certainly can. I am on Minds, Parler, Gab, MeWe, Facebook, and Twitter. I also am on Rumble, and I certainly recommend you subscribe to me on Rumble because if you like my political podcast, well, it is conservative, and therefore its days are certainly numbered on this platform. So as a backup, definitely want to make sure you're subscribed to the Rumble account. And again, that's www.rumble.com. Certainly appreciate anybody there. Anybody who wants to help me turn this into a career, I want to do this as well as other things for my overall career. You can do so by supporting financially. By virtue of giving to the Patreon, which is a subscription service, or giving any one-time payments to the PayPal. Please only do so if you feel that it is worth it. And please do not in any way, shape, or form financially strain yourself in order to do so. But if you do feel it is worth it, obviously, of course, I will be earning my income from you guys if I do indeed have this as a career, which is in the hands of the Lord, right? But I want to make sure it's earned. So I appreciate anybody who contributes there. And if you watch the majority of this video, that's the number one thing you can do for the algorithm. If you're keeping me in your prayers, that is the number one thing you can do for me. We serve an active and living God, friends. And so I want to make sure that you are constantly praying for the nation, constantly praying for me, for your own family, for yourselves. I am obviously in prayer for you guys as well. And may we be more in prayer every day. I want to remind you guys to please be watchdogs yourselves. Remember, this is the Synagogue News reminding you to think like a Neanderthal. And lastly, but not leastly, we want to say, in the face of Armageddon, will you compromise?